Well, hello and welcome to our study in the book of 2 Corinthians. So glad to have you along. Appreciate you for staying with me in this lengthy journey through the second letter that Paul writes to the Corinthians. And we're going to notice in this particular lesson that evidently he had visited them 3 times. We're not aware of one of those, probably one of the earlier ones. Anyhow, we're not aware of when that took place, but we'll get to that. I'm rushing. We'll get to that eventually. But I just wanted to emphasize we're in 2 Corinthians. It doesn't get the billing as 1 Corinthians, because it's the sequel, I guess you would say. But there's some amazing stuff in this, and some stuff that easily equals what we saw in 1 Corinthians, and not just rivals it, but goes beyond it, brings us some conclusions. So it's an exciting study. I hope that you're enjoying it. Let's just jump into what we've covered so far. By way of review, I like to do this in order to let the Bible speak and let it interpret itself. Here's the context we saw last time. For those of you who are part of the School of Biblical Studies, here are the 6 questions that you'll need to answer as you come through this particular lesson with us. But as we return to what we talked about in the conclusion of last lesson, remember he's talking about all of the stuff that he has gone through on behalf of the Lord. He's actually trying to reestablish his credibility with the church at Corinth. There are some folks who he's going to call in this study, at least the second time, he's going to call them super apostles, evidently referring to a group of individuals who had lifted themselves up in their own minds above what Paul was providing. And so he calls them super apostles. I think what's the word there? When you're speaking something that is I can't think of what the word is. It'll come to me here in just a moment. But he's not being completely accurate in what he's trying to say there. What is the word? Anyhow, he's used sarcasm. I knew if I just let this old brain give me a second, I'd get it. Sarcasm. That's what he's using when he calls them super apostles. But again, I rush. We're going too fast here. Verse 10, for the sake of Christ, then I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, etc. When I'm weak, then I'm strong. This refers us back to being, when he had the messenger of Satan, the thorn in the flesh, and the problems that he had, etc. He prayed 3 times. God said no. And so he came to this conclusion, when I am weak, then I am strong. And I think in that, again, he is trying to show his position with regards to, I am a vessel being used by God, rather than these super apostles or false teachers who are coming in who seem to be bragging upon themselves, and they set themselves up by their own authority. Remember, several lessons ago, we talked about these individuals who prove themselves by themselves. That's not much proof. I fear that we're finding a lot of our young preachers coming out of seminaries and Christian colleges and that kind of thing who are basically bowing down to the same kind of standard. They're proving themselves by themselves. In other words, I have the accolades from humans, therefore I must be. No. When you're dealing with spiritual stuff, you best have the accolades of heaven, or you have no credibility at all. And so Paul here, he's concluding, he's wrapping up this particular part by saying, look, when I'm weak, then I'm strong, referencing then, my credibility is rooted in what God does with me, not what I claim to be, as these super apostles seem to be claiming. All right, that's enough for review. Here's our new area of material. Verse 11 then of chapter 12. Let me go back and get that one last time. So we end up in verse 10. We're going to transition just a little bit. For when I'm weak, then I'm strong. Then verse 11, I have been a fool. Now, in this, he is referencing what he started off in chapter 11, a chapter ago in verse 1. Remember, he said, I wish you would bear with me in a little foolishness. And this is where he launches into this grand defense of why he has the paternal responsibility for this congregation and why he feels that he's been slighted, that they're just willing to throw their arms wide to these Judaizing teachers who come in here, but they're not willing to appreciate the fact that Paul had arrived with great power and the gospel that he delivered to them originally, they don't seem to appreciate that, and he's hurt by it. And so he spent a lot of verses here trying to, again, reestablish himself as a person who should be respected. Again, let me go back one more time. But not because he's something special, but because when he's weak, he's strong. The reason he's something special is because God had placed the message on his heart. And therefore the Corinthians were wrong for not appreciating the message that Paul had. All right, so we see that this thread of I have been a fool, this thread starts all the way back there in chapter 11, verse 1. And we're going to continue on with it somewhat. He says, I have been a fool, but you forced me to it, for I have been commended by you. And you know that's true. I shouldn't have to be standing around here proving myself, Paul says. You guys should be talking about me as being faithful. You should be the ones rushing to my defense, but you don't seem to be. For I was not at all inferior to these, and there's that super apostles, said again in such a way that he's not referencing, I don't believe, the actual apostles. I think he's referencing these false teachers who claim to be something special, okay? And so, false super apostles, that's one of your questions. Super apostles, even though I am nothing. Notice how he's going to contrast them. They think they're super apostles. I am nothing. And what he's saying, again, referencing back to the previous, is it that when I'm weak, I'm strong. I'm nothing. But God uses me as an empty vessel. They think they're everything, and because they're full of themselves, they don't have any room for God to use them. God can't move in. The signs of a true apostle were performed among you with utmost patience, with signs and wonders and mighty works. And so Paul is going to reference the fact that when I came and I taught you, the original moments that we had together, it was with power of God. Again, because I'm nothing. God worked in this situation. The credit should be given to him, and the credibility should be given to me because of him and the way that he worked through me, unlike these super apostles. If you were to pedal backwards again, letting the Bible interpret itself, chapter 11, verse 5, not too many verses prior. Indeed, I consider that I am not in the least inferior to these super apostles, the second use that we have there of that terminology. Even if I am an unskilled in speaking, I am not in knowledge. This was the big sign of his apostleship. He did other things, no doubt, but the big sign was he had knowledge, specific revelation for God. We saw last time, did we not, a discussion about how this individual, I believe he's speaking to himself, even speaking of himself, even though he spoke in the third person. I believe he's talking about himself being carried up into the third heaven. Remember that? All right, so he has special knowledge, and he imparted that. In every way we have made this plain to you in all things. Then, after talking about the true signs, the signs of a true apostle, versus those of a super apostle who claims this authority on his own without credibility from heaven. Verse 13, for in what were you less favored than the rest of the churches? So how do we slight you? Except that I myself did not burden you. Forgive me for this wrong. Forgive me this wrong. Forgive me this wrong. As we begin to launch into a following context here, now Paul is going to defend himself for not expecting financial support from the church at Corinth while he was with them. It's an odd text, and yet it's very, very applicable today. Paul will talk about that, that you ought not muzzle an ox as it treads out the grain and that kind of a thing, because a laborer is worthy of his hire, When an individual brings you something spiritual, there's nothing wrong with them benefiting financially, physically speaking, in order to maintain them so that they can continue to bring you spiritual things. It's the pattern of the entire scriptures. You go all the way back to the time of the prophets, and you see that the prophets were taken care of by those that were around about them. There was one couple actually built an extra bedroom onto their house to take care of one of the prophets. And so there's nothing wrong with God's men being supported by God's people so that God's men can continue to focus their minds and focus their message rather than having to run off and doing other secular work and that kind of thing. On the other hand, it's also okay at times, Paul clearly proves this, it's also okay at times when a man, a preacher, wants to use his hands, do other things in order to support himself, so that there's not a burden, which evidently Paul felt like was a burden that the Corinthians could not accept at that point. So he worked outside of that realm, and notice this, he's also going to be supported by other churches. Now this is a very important passage compared to this and our present day situation, especially to me, because I'm one of those individuals. There are folks watching right now who support me so that I can put out a message to folks that those people who support me may never meet this side of eternity. but they keep me alive. Now, notice what's happening here as he says, or did I commit a sin in humbling myself so that you might be exalted? Because I preached God's gospel to you free of charge. You didn't have to support me in any way. I robbed other churches. And again, that's a term of hyperbole. He didn't actually rob them. He's just saying that kind of in comparison here, it's as if I robbed them so that you could have what you needed. Other churches by accepting support from them in order to serve you. So he let other churches, Macedonia specifically, he's going to talk about, other churches are going to support Paul while he's in Corinth, and which again is the ongoing pattern even today. And when I was with you and was in need, I did not burden anyone, for the brothers who came from Macedonia supplied my needs, so I refrained and will refrain from burdening you in any way. And so Paul is up against a moment here, oddly enough, where evidently some folks are actually accusing him of not being credible because he didn't take money from the church to live. It's just upside down from the way that it happens to play out today. A lot of folks today think that if a preacher is supported by the church, he must be lazy. But anyhow, back to this context, Paul is having to fight that battle on all fronts with regards to his credibility. And here he makes this statement. He says, oh, forgive me, I didn't take any money from you guys when I was down there. And not that he would have or wanted to or would have turned the clock back and done it differently. He's just saying, think about what you're saying, folks. How did I wrong you by not taking financial support from you when I felt like that at this particular point, you didn't need that? What you needed was a preacher to be able to present to you the will of God, rather than also having the financial responsibilities to him. Then he's going to go into verse 14 and say, here for the third time I am ready to come to you. And this is that passage I was referencing in the opening, that evidently he came 3 times to the church of Corinth, and there's one of those times where we don't really know when that took place, but he alludes to it on several occasions, and so it evidently did happen. So he says, here for the third time I'm ready to come. So there's a third time that he's going to come to them. And he says, I'm not going to burden you then either. Watch this. And I will not be a burden, for I seek not what is yours, but you. Again, he's referencing this idea of I came to you, but I wasn't a burden to you. I didn't expect you to pay me while I was with you. And then he returns to that theme, and he says, I'm not going to be a burden when I come this third time either. And what I seek from you is you, not what is yours. Why would you think that I'm coming so that you guys would pay me off or whatever? No, I'm coming for you because I have this parental love for you, which he explains in the next line. For children are not obligated to save up for their parents, but parents for their children. You got it upside down. I, being the parent, am supposed to bring the blessing to you. And so don't think that I'm coming so that you can somehow pay me off. That's not what's going on here at all. Okay? Verse 15, I will most gladly spend and be spent for your souls. Pause, and then we'll get into what I've underlined here. Every parent that truly is a good, loving parent would say that. I'd do anything for my child, and I would. I've got 2 boys, and I'd go into financial debt. I'd die for my boys. Happy to do that, if that's what it took. And Paul is essentially, I most gladly spend and be spent for your souls. From a fatherly perspective, as he looks at the church at Corinth, Paul is saying that I'd go the distance for y'all. And I think what he's you're going to see in the next phrase, but what he's trying to establish is how much he loves them and how hurt he is by this constant need to reprove himself as the father, the paternal moment in the existence of this particular church. In this, he's not trying in any way to replace God. That's not what he's saying. But he is trying to take him all the way back to the beginning moments. I'm the guy who was there. I'm the guy who was delivering the gospel message to you. And yet you got these newbies that come in here and they upset the apple cart with all of their claims to being this, that, and the other super apostles. And you forget all about the guy who was there in the beginning. He says it doesn't make any sense. Then he says, if I love you more, am I to be loved less? Now this ties in with what I have up here. I have been a fool. You forced me to it, for I ought to have been commended by you. I shouldn't have to stand here and continue to defend myself. You should be defending me like you would defend your own father in the faith. But he says, so if I love you more, am I to be loved less? I'm trying hard here, my friends. I've just said I would do anything. for you and your souls. And I'm obligated to you as a parent. I'm obligated to you to take care of you. And so if I love you more, why do I get treated with less love? That doesn't make sense at all. I want to pause for a moment, not just to take a drink, but I want to pause. Forgive me, I dropped my lid. I want to pause for a moment and just recognize the journey that Paul has had with this church. I'm not saying that other churches weren't similar, but this is the only one that we really have this kind of a record for. But you see in this church such selfishness and carnality. It's what she's going to allude to here. But I think maybe the big one for me that I see in this is such infancy. There was such immaturity. This was remember, they're not far from Athens. And so they're like at the epicenter of humanism. And so you can see why it would take longer for it to take, if you will. Take longer for them to mature. Because they're at the center point of folks who think and are enamored with self. And so the church at Corinth is really struggling to grow up. And they're easily distracted. Obviously, in this case, they're distracted away from the one who originally gave them the gospel to individuals who just come in and sound good. But I think that there's a major application for the church today because we so often are just like that, aren't we? So often we act with that level of immaturity. And what we are enamored with is the guy who has the silver tongue who can stand in the pulpit, twice or three times a week. Boy, he just mesmerizes me for 30 minutes with what he has to say. And so he's got to be something special. And the guy who actually might not be able to talk quite as well, but has such depth of experiences and study in the Word, he's kind of shuffled off to the side. That's not right, is it? It's not good. And in this particular situation, we have such an infancy, an immaturity with regards to the church that they've actually forgot where they came from. There's a really, really sad, characteristic that plays out, I've noticed with some of our young people. They go off to college, and it's somewhere between 20 and 25, 26, 27, somewhere in there. There's this period of time when they become very, very selfish and forget their roots. They seem to forget to look over their shoulder and remember mom and dad and remember, and sometimes during that period of time they actually establish their own homes and they have their first child. And it's not until they really reach a real crisis moment, maybe the baby has a fever or whatever it is, that they remember, oh, mom might have some information with regards to that kind of thing. And they kind of get full of themselves. That's a very, very unfortunate period of time that often happens in the growthful youth, the youthful growth of a person. I feel like that the church at Corinth is kind of in that stage where they're starting to come to their own, but they're not mature, yet they think they're all full of themselves. And so they've started to reject the original message that Paul had given to them in favor of the glitz and the glory of the silver-tongued super apostles that have come their way. All right. Then as we turn the page, as it were, and we continue on, let's go back so we can get a full sentence here. But granting that I myself did not burden you, I was crafty, you say, and got the best of you by deceit? Really? You're saying I used craft and I was being crafty and I was deceitful when I came to you? Really? Did I take advantage of you through any of those whom I sent to you? I urged Titus to go and sent the brother with him. Did Titus take advantage of you? Did we not act in the same spirit? Did we not take the same steps? I just don't get you people, that you would think that I came in a deceptive mode when I am, as a father, looking to you with great love. And I return you to that phrase that he used. If I love you more, am I to be loved less? I'm trying to focus on you. And if you think about it, and again, I'm not saying that he didn't have focus on other churches. He certainly visited them too, etc., etc. But as far as the material that has been preserved for you and I, we got more material that has been written to the church at Corinth than I guess any other church in the New Testament that is talked about. Maybe rivaled by Jerusalem and what we know about the church of Jerusalem. But think about this. Paul has put a lot of emphasis and time into writing them 1st and 2nd Corinthians. If I love you more, am I to be loved less? I don't give this kind of time out just to anybody, Paul is saying. Have you been thinking all along that we have been defending ourselves? Now, this is where this is kind of in your face. He's going to kind of step toe to toe with them. He's going to say, have you been thinking all along as you've been reading this letter, have you been thinking that this is all about us defending ourselves to you? It is in the sight of God that we have been speaking in Christ, and all for your upbuilding, beloved. The point that he's making here, and this is where he turns the screw a little bit. The point that he's making here is that everything that I have said up to this point, although it is true I directed it in your direction, the point is I'm standing before God. Ultimately, my defense is to God or in God. And I'm speaking to you not so much as a defense of myself, but as a defense of myself in the sight of God. He's the greater judge here. And I think he's trying to push them again to spiritual maturity, to say that's what you need to funnel all of your decisions through. All credibility should come through whether or not it stands up in the sight of God. If it does that, it doesn't really matter whether it stands up in the sight of men. We got to stand up in the sight of God. For I fear that perhaps when I come, I may find you not as I wish. And he's really concerned about this next visit, that he's going to have to straighten some things out. And that you may not find me as you wish. That's kind of a subtle threat, I think. I think he's saying there that you may not, when I show up, I may not be as agreeable as you think as you would like for me to be. That perhaps there may be quarreling as you wish, and that you may find me not as you wish. That perhaps there may be quarreling, jealousy, anger, hostility, slander, gossip, conceit, and disorder. I fear that when I come again, my God may humble me before you, and I may have to mourn over many of those who have sinned earlier and not repented of their impurity, sexual immorality, and sensuality that they have practiced. I can't prove this because the context doesn't give us enough information to make such a statement, but this sounds a lot like what he talked about in 1 Corinthians. You might remember we had at least one example in 1 Corinthians of the fellow who's living with his father's wife, that perversion. And it seems like in 2 Corinthians that situation may have resolved itself. It sounds like Titus is bringing news back to Paul that they have repented. But if that's the case, and I think that it is, if that's the case, then this is evidently referring to even other situations. So you see, Corinth was not a nice place. And they had a lot of stuff happening. Now, watch it. He's going to come up here. He's going to say, I'm concerned that there's quarreling, jealousy, rage. All that stuff is true, disorder, etc. I'm really concerned about that. But it seems like he focuses in his conclusion more on sexual immorality. And that's the one that he really tags as he expresses his concern about the next visit. I'm going to have to attack all of this stuff, but he says, I'll tell you, boy, this is the thing. We still got some folks who haven't repented from their impurity, their sexual immorality, sensuality that they have practiced. All that stuff has to do with sex and the perversions thereof. So, by way of review, if you go back to 1 Corinthians, you see the guy who's living with his father's wife, and by implication, they're being intimate. Then you begin to see how low the value system has sunk in the church at Corinth. So much so that Paul's going to say they're actually celebrating this guy. And Paul's going to say, you got to quit that, and you have got to get that little bit of leaven out of the lump. He's going to say that you're going to have to deliver him to Satan, turn him over to the powers of the world, so that perhaps in that process, he will miss the church and want to come home. And it's a really vivid illustration of church discipline and how it can work, because I think 2 Corinthians is referring to the fact that guy did repent. And so Paul is laying, but my point is that why would he bring it up again? I think that there was more than just that one situation. It might have been the big one, but there was more than that one situation that was taking place there. All right, I think that's a snowstorm, so it's time for us to come back here and review one last time. The questions are here. I pray that verse-by-verse study has benefited you. I really enjoyed studying this part of the passages of 2 Corinthians out and presenting it. I pray that it's been a blessing. You certainly are a blessing to me. This is Sunny Chow saying be there. Matthew 16:26.